And it's interesting. I just had my 50th reunion, high school reunion. I got classmates that probably got great grandchildren,
Mm,
in that part. It's kind of weird in that respect.
hmm
Like you and I talked about that a little bit the
hmm
other day in terms of uh, that whole continuity of who you are as a person, and that's
hmm
through your children, your grandchildren, so on
hmm
and so forth. And
hmm
I've been going through this discovery. I just met my grandfather's brother, baby brother, for the first time this year,
Maternal
and
or paternal grandfather? Which grandfather?
paternal.
Okay.
Um, and
And let me
and
interrupt. So your father's uncle.
my father's uncle, exactly.
Yes.
And I met him for the first time. He's the last of brothers and sisters, and that was really cool. That was in Long Island, Bahamas, and
Mm,
again, that goes back to that connectivity of where you come from, and then
mm,
what are you leaving behind.
mm,
And I got to see pictures of my great grandfather, who I had never seen, and
mm,
through ancestry.com I kind of did some research and how I even found out who my great grandfather was, both of them. Well, I knew my great grandfather on my grandmother's side. I didn't know on my grandfather's side. But going through ancestry.com, my grandfather and grandmother's marriage certificate were signed by the fathers. So that's how I
mm.
found out my great grandfather on my father's side was Edmund Knowles on my grandfather's side, and I always knew who my great grandfather was on my grandmother's side.
Wow. There's so much that I have to ask you about as you gave that story. But one of the things that I wanted to say is that, often people see you, and I mean, you've been around for a while. You've done a lot of things in the community, and people have a very, sort of generalized impression about
Who I am and what
who you might be
the
or who
guy in
I
the bow
might
tie.
be. Yeah, and they generally speaking, I mean, this is true about everybody. People really don't know what people have experienced in their lives or what challenges they have or where they're coming from.
Right.
And I think it's particularly, I'm a lawyer, I've been a lawyer for 30 years. And one of the things that I think is important about this work that I'm doing right now is to say, yeah, this is what I've done, right? This is what I've been doing. But I want you to know that despite any appearances, this life hasn't been a walk of
Yeah,
roses.
a cakewalk, as they say.
Yes, it hasn't been a cakewalk.
No.
And yeah. And so with you, I mean, this is some stuff. You're going back and forth between Miami and New York. You're doing a grade here, a half grade there. You're coming back. And that's pretty challenging, but it also speaks to your ability to adapt and things along those lines. Um, Tell me about, and this is important because I'm talking about the fact that to me you seem to be an amazing dad, and I would like to know about your dad and what your experience was with him, because I hear you talking about discovering your great grandparents and so on and so on. So let's start, because oftentimes the guys that I've spoken to have said, well, my dad wasn't there, or, it was a thing for me to get right because I didn't have male guidance or direction or what have you. So you tell me about that aspect of yourself.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, meeting my father for the first time was when he got out of the military and came home. And I was, what, 5 years old, 6 years
Mm.
old, that I recall, meeting him for the first time.
You remember that
And
date. You remember
yeah,
that
yeah,
date.
actually, I do because my mother and I remember we drove from Lockport to Fort Bragg, North Carolina to pick him up. It wasn't like we
Wow.
flew home. They actually
Mm.
drove and picked him up. I have a picture. in front of one of the what was then the 82nd Airborne Club, which I used to hang out when I was in the Army. And I have a picture of me and my dad when I was 5 years old in front of this club.
Do you
So,
remember you were excited? Were you excited that
oh
day?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Mhm.
And so, you know, the minimal memory that I have of that, but I do remember the trip. And so here we are, I'm starting kindergarten. And as I said, I'm there kindergarten, first, second grade. And my mother and father, as I say it, when they weren't in the best place with one another, my grandmother came and got me.
Okay.
And I came to Miami in the third, fourth, and the first half of fifth grade. And I
Mhm.
lived with my grandmother's brother and family, my grand uncle.
Mhm.
And I had two cousins who were younger than me. And we basically slept in the same bed together, took baths together. So they're like
Mhm.
brothers and not really
Mhm.
cousins that I grew up with. And then my mother and father got their act together. So that second half of fifth grade, I went back to
Mhm.
Lockport. And I began to play Little League football, sixth grade and seventh grade. And my dad was, my dad was, uh, as they say, a man's man and a ladies' man. And that's probably that ladies' man part was why him and my mother had whatever issues they had.
They had issues.
Yeah, yeah. And so, and what did Jada Pinkett say? They had what was that saying she said?
I don't know
Um,
which one.
uh,
Which one?
what about anyway about what the incident she had with the younger guy,
Oh,
but
oh, okay.
relation. Well, I forgot what it. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But anyway, my dad played golf. Actually, my mom and dad played golf. Actually, they
Mhm.
introduced me to golf when I was young, but they didn't make me really learn the game
Mhm.
or push me to learn the game. My dad
Mhm.
bowled. He played cricket. I mean, he's from the Bahamas. He was a
Bahamas,
cricketer.
right, right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
he was a cricketer, and
Mhm.
so I learned to bowl. I used to go to cricket matches. And my dad, he was a very good-looking guy. And I remember everybody say, you look like your dad. And I'm gonna tell you another story after the fact. But anyway, so here I am back there in Lockport, fifth, sixth, and seventh grade. And that summer of me coming out of seventh grade, going into eighth grade, my mother left my father. And I went to stay with her for a week or two, and I went back home. And
Home to Miami?
no, home to her.
Okay, home to
Home
her.
to
Mhm.
dad, home to dad,
Right.
because my mom
Mhm.
moved out. So I went back to live went back home. And my dad asked me to show him where my mother was living. So me being a young kid, I
Mhm.
show him where he's living, she's living, and I'm sitting in the car. And I remember my dad telling my mother, if you don't come back, I'm going to kill myself.